I started noticing the photographs around March. Not all at once. Just slowly, the way you start to notice that a word you've been saying your whole life suddenly sounds wrong when you repeat it enough times. They were everywhere in the flat. On the mantelpiece, on the bookshelf, stuck to the fridge with magnets shaped like Italian landmarks we'd collected on a holiday 3 years before. Sarah and me at her sister's wedding. Sarah and me in front of the Pantheon. Sarah alone at some work event, holding a glass of wine, mid-laugh. I'd walked past these images thousands of times, but sometime in early spring, I started seeing them differently. Not the content. The quantity. The placement. The fact that Sarah had put them there, and I had simply let them accumulate like sediment. We'd been together 7 years. Married for 4. We lived in a 2-bedroom flat in Hackney, the kind of place that estate agents called characterful because the floorboards creaked and the bathroom tiles were the color of old teeth. Sarah worked in communications for a charity. I was a software contractor, mostly remote. We had what I thought was a good life. Meals together most evenings. Weekends where we'd walk to Broadway Market or meet friends for brunch. We talked about having kids, but in that abstract way people do when they mean not yet, maybe never, let's see. There was nothing dramatic. Nothing I could point to and say that's when it started. But the photographs bothered me. I couldn't explain why. One evening in April, Sarah came home late from a work dinner. I was on the sofa with my laptop, half watching something on Netflix. She dropped her bag by the door and kicked off her shoes. She looked tired. Her hair was pulled back in a way that made her face seem smaller. She said the dinner had been fine, a bit dull, the usual people saying the usual things. She poured herself a glass of water and sat down next to me. She smelled faintly of wine and perfume. I asked her if she'd had a good time and she said it was fine, just long. Then she leaned her head on my shoulder and we sat like that for a while, not talking. It should have felt comfortable. It did feel comfortable. But I kept thinking about the photographs. The one on the side table next to us. Sarah at the beach in Cornwall, 2 summers ago, her hand shading her eyes from the sun. I couldn't remember taking it. I must have. But I couldn't remember. I started paying more attention after that. Not in an obvious way. I didn't want to seem strange. But I watched how Sarah moved through the flat. How she touched things. She had routines I'd never really registered before. She always put her keys in the same bowl by the door. She always folded the tea towel in half before hanging it back on the oven handle. She always checked her phone in the morning while the kettle boiled, scrolling through emails with her thumb, her face blank and focused. These weren't new habits. She'd been doing them for years. But I was seeing them now as if from a distance, like I was watching someone I didn't quite know. At work, I found it hard to concentrate. I'd sit at my desk with code open on my screen, and I'd realize 20 minutes had passed and I hadn't written a single line. I kept thinking about small moments. The way Sarah said my name sometimes, not to get my attention but just as a kind of placeholder, like she was checking I was still there. The way she'd ask me what I wanted for dinner and then suggest something herself before I could answer. The way she'd tell me about her day in careful detail, as if she was filing a report, making sure I had all the information I needed. None of this was wrong. None of it was unkind. But it felt rehearsed. Like she was performing being in a relationship, and I was performing being her audience. I didn't say anything. What would I say? I feel like the photographs are too evenly distributed. I think you're being too considerate. It sounded insane even in my head. So I kept quiet. I smiled when she smiled. I laughed when she told me something funny from work. I asked her about her day and listened to her answers. But underneath it all, I was watching. I was cataloguing. And the more I watched, the more I noticed. She had a way of finishing my sentences. Not aggressively. Not in a way that interrupted. She'd just quietly complete the thought I was starting to form, as if she knew exactly where I was going. At first I thought it was a sign of how well she knew me. But then I started to wonder if it was something else. If she was shaping the conversation so carefully that I never got to finish a thought on my own. If I started to say I was thinking about and she'd say about going for a walk. Or about calling your mum. And I'd nod and say yeah, exactly, even though that wasn't what I'd been thinking at all. In May, we went to a friend's birthday party in Brixton. It was in a pub garden, one of those places with fairy lights strung between the trees and wooden benches that always seemed slightly damp no matter the weather. Sarah knew more people there than I did. She moved through the crowd easily, touching people's arms, laughing at jokes, asking questions that made people lean in and talk longer than they'd planned. I stood by the bar and watched her. She was good at this. She'd always been good at this. But I started to notice the pattern. She'd ask someone a question, and while they answered, she'd glance past them, scanning the crowd for the next person she needed to talk to. She was never rude. She'd nod and smile and react at the right moments. But she was always managing. Always calculating. She caught my eye across the garden and smiled, a small private smile that was supposed to say I see you, we're in this together. But it felt like something else. Like she was checking I was still playing my part. We left early. Sarah said she was tired, and I agreed. On the way home, she held my hand in the back of the Uber. She talked about the party, about who'd said what, about someone's new job and someone else's breakup. I made the right noises. But I kept thinking about the way she'd looked at me across the garden. The way she'd smiled, like I was a component in a system she was running smoothly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Sarah, listening to her breathe. She slept on her side, facing away from me, her body curved into itself. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the 7 years we'd been together. I tried to remember the beginning. The first time we'd met, at a friend's flat in Peckham. The first time we'd kissed, outside a pub in Soho after too many drinks. The first time I'd stayed at her place, waking up in her single bed with the morning light coming through thin curtains. I could remember the facts. I could remember the sequence of events. But I couldn't remember the feeling. I couldn't remember what it was like to be spontaneous with her. To not know what she was going to say next. To be surprised. I started testing her. Small things. I'd suggest something we'd never done before. A different restaurant. A film she wouldn't normally watch. A walk in a part of London we'd never been to. And every time, she'd agree. She'd say yes, that sounds nice, let's do that. And then she'd take over. She'd look up the restaurant and book a table. She'd check the film times and buy tickets. She'd plan the route for the walk and mention a place we could stop for coffee. She was being helpful. She was being efficient. But I started to feel like I'd never actually made a decision. Like every suggestion I made was just an opening for her to step in and arrange things the way she thought they should be arranged. One Saturday in June, I told her I wanted to spend the day alone. I didn't give a reason. I just said I needed some time to myself. She looked at me for a moment, her face calm and unreadable. Then she nodded and said, of course, that's fine, I'll go see my sister. She kissed me on the cheek and left the flat within half an hour. I sat on the sofa and felt the silence settle around me. It should have felt like relief. It should have felt like space. But instead it felt like evidence. Like she'd been expecting this. Like she'd already planned what she'd do if I ever asked for distance. I spent the day walking. I left and walked through Victoria Park, along the canal, all the way to Mile End and then further, past the stadiums and the retail parks, into parts of East London I'd never been to. I didn't have a destination. I just wanted to move. I wanted to be somewhere Sarah hadn't organized. Somewhere she hadn't anticipated. I stopped in a cafe I'd never heard of and ordered a coffee from a barista who didn't smile. I sat by the window and watched people pass. Couples holding hands. Parents with pushchairs. Teenagers laughing at something on a phone. Everyone looked like they were inside their own lives, making choices that felt real to them. I wondered if I looked the same from the outside. If someone watching me would think I was just another person living a normal life. If they'd have any idea that I was sitting there trying to work out when I'd stopped being real. I got home late. Sarah was already back. She'd made dinner. Pasta with something green and leafy, a salad, a glass of wine already poured for me on the table. She asked if I'd had a nice day and I said yes. She said she'd had a nice time with her sister, they'd gone to a market and bought some candles. Did I want to see them? I said sure. She showed me the candles. They smelled like fig and sandalwood. She said she thought they'd be nice in the bathroom. I agreed. We ate dinner and talked about nothing important. She asked if I was okay and I said I was fine, just needed a bit of space. She nodded and said she understood. And I believed her. I believed she did understand. But I also believed she'd been expecting it. That she'd seen it coming.